good afternoon, and you are very welcome to today's information webinar. This is on behalf of Cancer Trials Ireland and is on the Just Ask page. You'll know that already if you're on the Just Ask page. And we are going to be talking this afternoon about cancer trials and about what they might mean to you or to somebody in your life and how important they are in the treatment and in the research and in all of the development around cancer treatments. I'm joined by a very eminent panel this afternoon. I'm Dr. Ciara Kelly and I'll be your host. This is Professor Gerry Hanna, and he is the Deputy Clinical Lead for Cancer Trials Ireland. We have Dr. Kilty, who is from the Irish Cancer Society. And perhaps most importantly, we have Jed Van de Paul, who is a patient himself who not only has had cancer, he's had multiple myeloma, but has taken part in the cancer trial. And I suppose our efforts here this afternoon is to demystify the idea of going on a cancer trial, is to give information to you about how to go on a cancer trial. And I suppose to, unpick and unravel all of the different strands and maybe the concerns you might have about it and what it might mean for you or your cancer treatment. We will be taking questions. We would be delighted to take your questions. And as far as I am aware, there is a way of you uploading those questions and they will get to us and we will answer them as best we can. Possibly not me, possibly my esteemed colleagues here on the panel today. But we're going to start off by talking to you, Jed, if that is okay. I suppose we're just going to get you to tell your story. And as I mentioned, you had multiple myeloma. Do you want to tell me a little bit about how and when you were diagnosed?
Well, I was diagnosed in March of 2022, so 3 years ago, and it was as a result of a different disease, diverticulitis, and I had an abdominal scan. And while the scan was being shown to me regarding the diverticulitis, I noticed a very large bone lesion in my pelvis, and that then it clicked with something else that had happened to me recently, which was that I had a spontaneous rib fracture, which I was still suffering from. And so my mother, many years before, had been diagnosed with multiple myeloma, and she was diagnosed because she had a spontaneous collarbone fracture.
Okay.
So I put two and two together, and so when I was told that was the diagnosis, that I did have myeloma, I was prepared for it. So it was rather easier for me since I'd sort of self-diagnosed. Uh, but that's normally not the case with a cancer diagnosis. It comes as a much greater shock.
Yeah, and I know you're saying that, but obviously because your mum had it as well, it is still quite shocking when it's you.
It is, but I would have to say that the biggest difficulty in the diagnosis was actually having to tell my family,
Okay.
and particularly my wife. We were still in the middle of COVID. Nobody was allowed into the hospital, no family. So I actually had to make. It was a few days later before it was properly confirmed, and I had to give her the bad news over the phone, which is really not how you want to pass on that sort of a diagnosis. And yes, it affected my family
Did
quite severely.
did your wife and your family, did they understand the implications of what you were telling them? It's quite hard to, as you say, do that over the phone and terms like multiple myeloma, it wouldn't be the commonest cancer, so therefore not everyone would know what it meant or what it was.
Unfortunately, they knew very well that what multiple myeloma was because my mother had died from it, and I think that was probably the greatest shock to them because she only survived 2 years from diagnosis, and in fact she went. I suppose you could call it an early cancer trial. She was put, and normally in those days it was you'd have maybe a 1 year life expectancy,
Mhm.
and so they said, well, if you have this very powerful um, steroid, and if you try some radiation therapy, we can maybe extend your life expectancy, which it did. She survived for 2 years,
Okay.
but my family were all too well aware of that, and they didn't know, and mine, and neither did I, how incredibly the the research had progressed, and um,
So are you saying that when you said to them, I have multiple myeloma, they were thinking, well, we know that that probably means you only have a year or two to live, that was what was in their heads?
that's right, and perhaps I wasn't as sensitive to that. My son had to drive home from work. He was, he was so upset. So I think I was a little bit, I suppose I got my own issues. I'd just been diagnosed.
It's really interesting you say I wasn't sensitive to that, but you were in hospital on your own with COVID, not able to have visitors, and had just been diagnosed with cancer. So sensitive, you not being sensitive, that's an interesting way of viewing yourself because you were clearly going through quite a lot.
Yes, indeed. It's, uh, I mean, one of the things that struck me then was, subsequently I was offered a trial, and then I thought back to my mother, and if not for people like her going through actually then being given things like strong medicines, radiation, uh, we wouldn't be where we are now. And I think that's a big thing when it comes to cancer trials, is that if not for people going on these cancer trials, then we would make no progress, and we wouldn't be finding the drugs that do extend my life and various
So
others.
what I am hearing from you is that you were reasonably open to the idea of trials in general because your mum had gone on something that was new and a bit groundbreaking and wasn't sort of the standard treatment, and she had done well. I mean, she had doubled her life expectancy, so she had done well. So you were, even from the get-go in your diagnosis, well predisposed to the idea of a trial.
Very much so, and two main reasons. One is that I wanted to be on the very latest medication, and I very much am. Um, the particular trial drug that I'm on, it uses my own immune system. Called an immunotherapy, because it uses my own immune system to tackle the cancer, to attack the cancer, and these are the very latest drugs that are coming along. So when I heard that that was available to me, then yes, I very much wanted to be on it.
Could you tell us, Jed, a little bit about the treatment program that you went on specific to you? So you're on immunotherapy, and what else sort of happened in terms of your course of treatment, what you experienced?
Well, uh, I was told very early on, before I was offered the trial, that I would be on what's called the standard of care, which was a triplet of drugs that were currently being used for treatment of multiple myeloma. And just thinking of those, each one of those drugs had gone through a trial itself. People had been given that as an experiment, if you like, eventually that had been passed. So even if I hadn't decided to go on this new trial, I was already on three drugs. I would be put on three drugs that would have already been trialed. So it just driving home the importance of drug trials.
Yeah. So you would have been offered one course of treatment. And just for people listening, were you offered that course plus an add-on, or were you offered a separate course?
Now this was a plus, and I think it's one of the myths of trial drugs, is that whether in my case everyone in the trial has been given the drug, but sometimes you hear of these blind trials where 50% have the drug and 50% don't, and the concern there is that, oh, I'm not being treated for the cancer if I'm not on the trial drug. And that absolutely isn't the case. In my case, I was on a triplet of drugs, standard of care, and an additional drug, and that is always the case. Either it's placebo, or it's the actual drug.
So, and I think that's really an important point. I think we would all agree to hammer home that nobody is getting a sugar pill when they are a cancer patient, and then other people are on the drug. That simply that doesn't happen, because I think it's very important to point out that ethically that would never be allowed to happen. That nobody is denied care ever in order to facilitate a trial. That's not how this works. You're offered a treatment and then an add-on to see if the add-on improves the outcomes.
That's right. Now, um, just because you have applied to have it, to go on a trial, unfortunately, it doesn't always mean that you can. And there are various reasons. In my case, I passed the trials, so to speak. Uh, um, and one of the specific requirements was that I had had no other treatment for my cancer before I started on this drug. It's interesting to note that there is another trial running at the same time for the same drug, where the pre-trial requirement is that you have been on many different drugs and have which haven't been successful, and that is their basic requirement. So you can not meet the requirements for various reasons, usually nothing to do with your health, but much more to do with your past.
Yeah. And we will talk about that. Myself and Gerry will talk about that. But it's important to remember that trials tend to be asking a specific question because they have to get a specific answer. So therefore, the criteria that is put around patients entering the trials, they're relatively specific. Um, there are other benefits to being on a trial, though. You do get sort of quite a lot of support as well. Isn't that fair to say?
Yes, I think one of the things is I have a speed dial to the trial nurse. So if anything happens that is untoward, I can ring her. She'll organise bed, and I'll be immediately brought into the hospital. It's happened on a couple of occasions. Part of the protocol for this trial is that if my temperature goes over 38 degrees centigrade, that I must immediately go into the hospital, and that has happened on two occasions.
Okay. And before I bring in Gerry, tell us how you are now. How are you feeling? How is life now?
Well, I've been on these drugs now for 3 years. I'm on what's called a maintenance dose, so I only have two treatments a month, compared with uh, 2 or 3 treatments a week in the beginning. I've been in remission now for over 2.5 years, which for myeloma is very good news. When I was offered the trial, um, uh, it was made very clear that multiple myeloma is incurable, and still is, according to all the textbooks. But this drug, isatuximab, um, is could be it could be a cure for multiple myeloma, but we won't know. Probably in my lifetime, I won't know because I will be on this for the rest of my life.
Time is how we will probably find that out, isn't it?
Yes.
If I could bring you in, Gerry, and if you have just joined us, you're very, very welcome. This is Cancer Trials Ireland, our information webinar. We're talking about cancer trials. This is part of the Just Ask campaign, and we are delighted to have you. And please do ask questions. But I'm going to bring you in, and this is Professor Gerry Hanna, who is the clinical lead, the deputy clinical lead, the vice clinical lead, to get that right, with Cancer Trials Ireland. How unusual is Jed's story, Gerry, in that he kind of went straight onto a trial?
Yes, so it's strange. You might think it's a little strange. It's actually not that unusual, though often trials are very often second or third line. And Jed, it's a wonderful story, Jed. It's lovely to have you here with us today, and I'm glad the trial went really well, and that's good so far. Our trials are positioned across all the tumor types, and across all the stages and settings of disease. And that's everything from screening through diagnosis, through first-line treatment, and into second line and further what we'd call treatment for advanced disease. So it's across all the diseases. We also have trials that look not just at treatments, but at supportive care. How do we support people through a cancer diagnosis? How do we help them get around a busy hospital system? We have a great study in that called the EU Navigate study at the moment. So we have trials in almost nearly every setting in cancer, which is great. And then we also have what we call the preclinical studies that we do that are not in patients. We test new drugs out, see do they work in certain settings, or we look at new forms of diagnosis or detection of cancer. So it's across the range of everything that we do in cancer, so to speak. But yes, we do have a lot of trials whereby we look at new drugs, even before, as if you take the example of breast cancer, we have trials that look at giving certain type of drugs or chemotherapy before surgery for breast cancer to see can that, improve the outcomes for people who are having breast cancer surgery. So it's in absolutely every setting.
Jed mentioned the fact that because he's on a trial, he has sort of his nurse on speed dial. But there is, because I suppose of the nature of a trial, there is a sort of an elevated level of care, isn't there, for patients involved in the trial? It's one of the reasons why patients might want to get involved in access to diagnostics, etc.
No, so certainly we generally have a much more monitoring on a clinical trial, sometimes extra hospital visits, sometimes extra scans as needed as part of that clinical trial. And the reason for this is we really want to make sure that we carefully monitor patients through trials so we're sure of the result. But secondly, we also want to make sure patients are as safe as possible through a clinical trial. And that's the purpose of Jed's speed dial nurse, so to speak, that he can contact somebody if he feels unwell and can seek help very quickly, and we can actively monitor that person to really make it as safe as possible. You're right, patients do sometimes want to take part in clinical trials because of that extra monitoring or the extra visits or the extra care that's around that treatment, so to speak, as well. And then also, we know that for hospitals that take part in clinical trials, that are very active in clinical trials, for patients who are not in those trials or just getting standard of care, their care is often better, or the outcomes of their care is better, because we think this improves the quality of our healthcare system. So doing clinical trials is not just about trying to find the next generation treatment, it's about improving the quality of care overall. That's a very good indirect effect of clinical trials.
And we are going to put some questions, because we got some questions in before the webinar started, which is great. And it is an interactive webinar, and we do want to know what you're thinking, and we do want to know your kind of feedback on all of this. But in terms of outcomes, Gerry, do we know clinical trials, those patients who are on the clinical trials, do their outcomes differ?
So we know generally overall patients who are in clinical trials, if we take the whole sum of clinical trials, they generally will have better outcomes than the standard of care in a disease setting in that stage and so on. And that's really because those patients have access to a novel treatment that will generally hopefully improve, the survival or the quality of life or whatever we're looking to do and so on. Some trials are not about improving the survival per se. Some trials are about what we call de-escalating care. In other words, where we think the control rates are very high or very good, or we think that, say, one drug in say, triplet of drugs is not useful or not needed, then sometimes we do de-escalation studies, and we're trying to make sure that it's safe to reduce that drug out of the treatment kind of, component, and yet make sure the quality of life is better.
This is the idea that we would have seen in the past, where people moved away maybe from mastectomy for all breast cancers to lumpectomy and things like that. So we were reducing intervention,
Yes.
but maintaining outcomes. So that's a kind of a simple way of people to,
Very much so.
and lots of people, I'm sure, viewing would think that way. And this is very much in line with what we were saying, Jed, about the fact that the trials are about progressing treatment.
Absolutely. We're always trying to see, how do we make things better? We know that cancer outcomes have improved massively over the last 40 years, mainly through clinical trials. And if you look back 40 years ago, 25% of patients were alive 5 years after cancer diagnosis. That figure now is greater than 50%, which is great news. We want it to be at least 75% in the next 10, 20 years. And we only can do that if we improve our outcomes through the likes of clinical trials.
I have some questions here, and I'm going to put a couple of them to you now, and then we're going to bring you in as well, Ciara, because I know you're sitting there and very patiently. First question. Have you a trial for this? Loads and loads of people have been messaging the webinar saying, have you a trial for ovarian cancer? Have you a trial for colon cancer? Do you have a trial for this or that? Very hard to answer all of those questions specifically, but if somebody is looking for a trial for their type of cancer, or maybe for a family member's type of cancer,
Absolutely.
what should they do?
So first thing I say, we have a large range of trials open. So we have 110 clinical trials open all across the disease site. So that's the first good news. We don't have trials for absolutely everybody. And as you said here, sometimes trials have very specific inclusion criteria where they want to really be specific about the question they're answering. But if you want to find out, first thing is to just ask. So just ask your clinician, your doctor, your clinical team, is there a trial for me in this setting? And they'll be more than happy to answer it for you. In fact, they'd be delighted you probably asked in a way. The second thing then is on Cancer Trials Ireland, that's cancertrials.ie, there's a very big search tab on the webpage, and you can look in and say, for colon cancer in Dublin, is there a trial for my type of disease? Some of the terms might be slightly confusing. So we use terms such as advanced or adjuvant, but there are little descriptors in the little tab beside that. So do click on those or do Google the phrase and it'll tell you the trials that are open. Now we update that web page as often as possible, but if you haven't found one immediately, please check back and check that the trial is still there. So and that's one source of information, but just ask your doctor.
Ask your doctor, and you can go to the Cancer Trials website. But some of the, let's be honest, some of the terminology that we use as doctors is a little bit not user friendly, because we talk in a bit of jargon. So for example, if somebody has bladder cancer, they may go onto the website, they may not see bladder cancer, they may see genitourinary cancer. So sometimes
Yes.
you might have to dig around. If you don't see your type of cancer, you might say, well, what type of cancer do I have? Is it, you might want to put it into a Google search yourself and see if you can find out more information that might make it clearer to you.
Which grouping does it come in
Yeah.
and which setting? And again, and it might take a little while to work that through and do check back, but even take the information you've got and bring it to your doctor. And again, they'll be happy to go through that with you. And if there are any questions.
Or you might need a little bit of help from a family member or something. It might be something you might spend a little bit of time on. Don't look at it and go, oh, I'm not there. What I need is not there.
And do check back because it does get updated because we have trials that come and open and close. So please do check back routinely on that webpage, which is brilliant.
Other questions that are coming in, lots and lots of them, are around eligibility. Sort of one woman, for example, says she doesn't qualify for a trial because she previously was on a different, she had a different type of cancer to the one that she has currently. Unfortunately, God, I'm so sorry to hear that you've had two types of cancers, but it was reasonably recent that she had a different type of cancer. So she's saying she thinks she's not eligible. Will you just explain to people why these eligibility criteria are there and why they might be important? Because must be really hard if you want to be on a trial and you go, well, why, I want to take part. Why not me?
That can be really discouraging. You're absolutely right, Kieran. People do get a little upset by that. But yeah, I think to understand is that when we do a clinical trial, we want to make sure we answer the question that we're seeking to answer very accurately with the best information possible. And if we aren't strict about people who go in and out, and not strict about the design of the study or, what treatments we're using or what follow-up, we may miss an important result. We might say that a drug isn't effective when actually it was. And also, when we're looking at the two arms of the study, if there are other factors that are not related to the cancer type of the treatment, such as a previous other cancer, then that can confound the result. Those can mix the results up a little bit.
Yeah.
And therefore, we might miss the opportunity. In trials, first of all, they're expensive to run. They have a huge commitment from patients and their family. We're really grateful for that. And of course, a big commitment from the clinical team. So we really want to use all of that resource very carefully and get the best answers we can.
And that must be very, very hard. But basically, you're saying you can't muddy the waters. You have to ask a narrow question, and therefore you have to put a narrow set of patients in to answer that question.
Yeah. And sometimes it's in the earlier the phase of a clinical trial, those, what we call inclusion criteria can be quite strict. As a trial goes to later phases, they tend to relax out a little bit, but they'll be more inclusive. We have been overly selective in certain groups, and there is a move to try and widen out the criteria for trials. So one example is how fit somebody is. And we very often have taken the very fittest of people to be, to include them in clinical trials. We're now relaxing that a little bit in certain cancer types to make it more realistic population that we look after or treat.
Yeah, and I presume that it's not comforting if you really want to get on a trial, but as the trials progress and as results come in, any benefits that are seen in terms of treatment will be given to the patients who would not have been included in the trial. So the trial still is of benefit to people who aren't on the trial.
Well, that's what we hope anyway, that the enhanced care around it and so on. Some trials do have a what we call crossover design, whereby people who are on the newer treatment, so to speak, can very often then the people who weren't on that after a period of time are crossed over. But that's very much dependent on the trial design as it goes through.
Okay, a couple of other questions, and then we will move on a little bit. Someone was asking about this trial's available in other countries, but not here. And for example, this person has a daughter who's on a trial in New Zealand. The drug that she's on is keeping her well,
Yes.
but that drug is not available here by way of treatment. And they're sort of saying, well, that seems unfair. And you can understand why.
Oh, absolutely. Heart goes
Yeah.
out to them that way, in the sense that you only can get it there. I mean, there's a lot of things around that. I mean, as Jed said, sometimes in different healthcare settings, when the trials are being designed, different questions will be posed depending on what is being the standard of care in that healthcare setting already. And that's different across the world, compared to, say, if you take the example of New Zealand and Ireland, or indeed Ireland and the UK. So there can be different, settings or, treatments that lead up to the question of the trial. So that's the first bit on that. Also, we don't really want to run two different trials that are answering the same question at the same time, because that's not efficient, and it's not
Sure.
really fair on patients that's going to take part in a trial that there's another trial could have answered that question elsewhere. So we will tend to really only have what we call non-competing studies that don't overlap in that way. And that's probably the main reason why we don't have two trials today. Sometimes we just don't get approval from whoever the manufacturer of the drug is,
Sure.
or indeed whoever the funder of the trial is, to spread a trial, because trials are very expensive and they can't run everywhere all the time. And that's why they're a bit limited
And
that way.
and maybe lastly, in terms of questions before we move on, and one of our viewers out there, hello, good afternoon. We're very glad to have you. Cancer cells seem to be able to evade treatment after a time and begin to spread again. Are there any clinical trials taking place to examine the reason for that?
Yes, so we have a lot of what we call translational studies, that whereby patients will be asked to donate, for instance, samples such as blood, and also tissue samples at the time of diagnosis and at the time that the cancer comes back. And scientists in the lab are looking at those cells to say, what has changed, or what is the difference between those who relapse and those who don't relapse? Are there certain characteristics of those cancer cells that relapse or different? Now, we know a lot about that already, but we're trying to be more specific about that, working out, are there things that we can do, again, tablets that prevent that from coming back. And so there's a lot of work going on about that everywhere and across a lot of tumor sites. Obviously, we haven't answered that just yet. We know that certain molecules or proteins in the cell surface are needed for cancer cells to spread elsewhere. And again, we know a bit about that, but we don't know enough. And that's the purpose. Those translational studies are very important. That's an example of a trial where you might not get a new treatment, but you're asked to take part in the study. That study will be looking at, for instance, what your tissue looks like compared to how you fare with your cancer afterwards.
Okay. We want to talk a little bit about the things that might put you off joining a trial, because I think it's fair to say, guys, that, and I'm going to bring you in here, Claire, that there are quite a lot of sort of myths about being on a trial that might frighten patients away from them. For example, some people might think, I think you have highlighted this very well, Jed, that it wasn't the case as usual, but that trials are there as a last resort for patients who perhaps have a very bad prognosis now and things like that. But that isn't a blanket sort of condition at all, Claire, is it?
No, not at all. In fact, there's trials available for all stages of a person's cancer journey. So we hear from patients all the time, and there's that fear. So the doctor offers them a clinical trial, or they hear about a clinical trial, and they automatically go, "Oh no, my cancer must be so advanced because
Yeah.
I've been offered
And
a
it
clinical
frightens
trial now." It really does. And what I will say is, every cancer medicine, if you have an early stage cancer and you're going on a cancer medicine, that has to be tested in a clinical trial. And it's how we develop new cancer medicines at those early stages, as well as those late stages that have less side effects. So actually, if you've been invited to go on a cancer clinical trial, you're incredibly lucky, because you're going to get first access to a drug years before any other patient gets access to a drug. And that's really, really important.
So you could be in the early stage, you could be stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. You don't have to be in the most advanced stage. That's not true. And that was the case with yourself, Jed. You were offered it from the get-go.
That's right. Though, having said that, I was a little, I was a little concerned when I asked the consultant, how long had I had it, because I thought I must have had this a long time because of the number of bone lesions. And he said, "Well, you've had it about 6 to 9 months." And but my particular cancer is a very, very rapid developer, so it can be. It doesn't always mean you've had it for a very long time. It can be that it's just suddenly come upon you, and it's the type of cancer that goes through your body very quickly.
Sure. The Irish Cancer Society Care are very good at offering support and reassurance to people around the time of diagnosis of cancer. And you're very familiar with the kind of fears and maybe misinformation that patients with cancer are dealing with, aren't you?
Absolutely. As I said, we have a support line and we get these questions in all the time. And so there are the misconceptions such as the placebo, such as the last resort. But I think a really important point is also there's a lot of logistical and practical worries that a person affected by cancer has when they're considering going on a trial. There's a lot of worries they have when you get diagnosed with cancer, but not also with going on a trial. So, for example, we know that cancer patients have a lot of financial barriers. Often, you've got a decrease in income when you're diagnosed with cancer. Your expenses go up. There's things like car parking charges. There's things like petrol, having your dinner in the hospital. And so, if you're asked to go on a trial, sometimes you might think, oh, that means maybe extra appointments that I need to go to. Maybe, I don't have a car to get there, you know. So, for example, not all trials are open in all regions. Some trials are open in certain regions, but not all. So, a patient might have to travel. And when we talked to some of our patients, one made a point that if they were to go for a trial in Dublin, it would be an 8 hour round trip. And that's a real concern, you know. So, what I would say is some trials, their out of pocket expenses are covered. It depends who funds the trial. That's not certainly the norm or the case across the board. But if anyone is really worried about those financial aspects, be it whether they've cancer and they're not being off the trial or whether they're going on a trial, also please do get in touch.
Yeah.
We have a number of travel grants that we could potentially offer. We have a transport service that can bring people to their chemo. And we also have a new welfare and supports team to provide financial advice and welfare advice to people. So you can simply just ring us on 1-800-200-700 and we'll be happy to answer any questions you might have on those concerns.
I think anyone who is diagnosed with cancer at any point should touch base with the Irish Cancer Society. And there are local cancer services too, local groups that do all that. But you guys liaise with all of that stuff, and it is a really good way to go. I know we touched on this earlier, Gerry, but the idea, will you just, I suppose, reiterate for people, because I think one of the things you do see when someone is diagnosed with cancer, you're overwhelmed and you can't take in all the information you're given all at once. It's sort of like being bombarded. But let's go back and just be very clear about the idea that some people have is, I don't want to go on a trial because I don't want to be the person that gets the placebo, as in the non-treatment, when other people, like half of us will get the placebo and half of us will get the treatment. Explain again, just to be very, very clear for people, how nobody gets no treatment.
Yeah, so again, the good news about trials is that most people do want to consider being on a trial, and we've surveyed them through Cancer Trials Ireland. But usually, as you say, but the trial design is always designed that at least taking part in the trial is as good as the standard of care. Now that's that.
Just, I think we should repeat that. It's at least as good as the best standard of care available. So that's
Hopefully, if you're
that or better.
yeah, and hopefully if you're in the test arm, it should hopefully be better. Now we can't guarantee that until the study goes through, but it should be at least as good. And usually a lot of trial designs, say for instance, there's drugs A and B that are the standard of care. That'll be the standard of care arm. We might add drug C to drugs A and B. Sometimes when we know more about those tablets,
Jed was on.
yeah, and sometimes we know more about those sort of treatments. It might be A and B versus C, and that's when we know that C is much more effective than we initially thought it was. So trials do evolve. And that's why we have very often different phases of clinical trials as we try and work through that path. And that's first of all to be really safe to patients, but also to make sure they don't lose out on the best possible care for them, for their type of cancer in their disease setting. So there's a kind of bit of an evolution that goes on in clinical trials.
I'm really glad you mentioned that you'd be on A and B here, and you might be on A, B, and C here, or you could end up just on C, but it's only because C is now proving itself to be unbelievable.
Yeah.
One of the reasons people might be afraid to go on a trial is that idea that there's some kind of a guinea pig, that they're being sort of experimented on. We just, I suppose, unpick that a little bit for people, because these are the things that might
Put people off.
prevent people from getting a better standard of care and treatment than otherwise. So
Yeah.
we want people to understand all this stuff very clearly.
Though I'm saying a very funny anecdote. I did have a patient once, or a colleague with a patient in Belfast, who was on a trial, and his teacher said, "I am a human guinea pig," but of course it's not quite true. In trials, obviously, when we talk about trials to patients, you get a lot of information. It'll be written. We'll talk to you about. You get a chance to go away and think about it, come back at least the next day or something like that, and we'll go over it again. So it's very much a voluntary process. So we want people to be happy to take part in trials, whilst we encourage them. It's a very personal decision. It's something you'll chat through with your family, friends, and so on, and say, is this for me or not? And people make a very clear decision. Most people, thankfully, do consider them. But in the trial design, as we say, it's not like a guinea pig. It should be at least as good, because all our trials now are designed usually with a large committee of people. Doctors, we always now tend to have patients as part of our trial management group. Those patients will give us very direct feedback about what's acceptable for a patient or not, from a patient perspective. And that's really, really helpful. And we're very grateful for those patients given their time as part of that. And then the trial, whenever it's designed and so on, will then go usually for a number of approvals. One key one is the Research Ethics Committee. And in that Research Ethics Committee, we look through the trial, make sure it's safe, make sure the observations or the number of scans, for instance, aren't a big burden. We try and reduce the burden on patients, but yet try and answer the trial as effectively as possible. And on those Research Ethics Committee, they'll be usually populated by doctors especially. Most of them will have at least a lawyer, and there'll usually be a number of patient representatives. So they very carefully consider, is this trial appropriate?
Yeah.
Is it safe? Is it asking the right question? And there'll be very often, sometimes, a lot of, even for a very well-designed trial, it may take a couple of goes at going to the Research Ethics Committee stage before it'll get approved.
I was actually going to say that too. Even the very design of the trial has to go through a whole ethics review, doesn't it? So that
That's
it's
very
designed
Yeah,
to be ethical.
absolutely. And that's the law. So we can't conduct a clinical trial here in Ireland unless it's been approved by a proper Research Ethics Committee.
Jen, did you have any of these concerns around the experimental nature or things like that? Did you feel in any way, and can you relate to, I mean, these are questions that we know people want answered. So can you relate to these questions? Did you have any of those concerns yourself?
I'll be honest, I didn't. My background is scientific, so I had
That probably helped.
it did. I had probably a lot more knowledge, and particularly, of course, because my mother had been through this particular cancer, so I didn't have the concerns that I think people normally would have. It was just I had more information.
Yeah.
But one of the things that did interest me is because, of course, I did ask, well, am I the first person to go on this drug? Because I'm patient 001 on this particular trial. So I was interested to know that. And they said, no, that's not the case, because I'm on a phase 2 trial. So a phase 2 is to see the efficacy of the drug at a particular level that had been decided on the phase 1 trial. The phase and you don't see any phase 1s here. Is it full?
We have a low level of those in Ireland at the moment, but because they're very often the first in human studies, we're trying to make more of those available to patients, and I know there'll be hopefully some coming very soon, particularly to the Dublin area, and that'll be rolled out. They are very consuming of time to undertake, so that's probably why we haven't been there yet.
Claire, do you see a lot of concerns around the experimental nature, that people are worried about that aspect of clinical trials?
We do, yeah, and the fear that, as Jed spoke about, that people feel that, but this is just going to be put into me and it hasn't properly been tested. But Gerry was highlighted the rigor that goes into it, and I suppose from our point of view, like before it even gets into a human, you're talking years and years of tests in the lab. As a former lab scientist and myself, I know the scientific rigor that goes into testing these treatments before they'll ever get to a phase 1 point. So I suppose we always try to reassure patients that they've really, really been rigorously tested.
That is what's warring inside somebody very often who isn't from maybe a scientific background, who has cancer, that kind of hope versus fear, isn't it? That they're like, I want to do this, but I'm afraid. And I suppose that's why we're here. We're kind of trying to demystify it and assure people around the ethical, rigor, as you say, and the value of all of this. Because you're the Irish Cancer Society. You're not a drug company. You're not anything like that. You are literally somebody kind of going, we're here trying to make the lives of people with cancer easier. better.
Yeah. And we're here because we want to do all that we can to make sure that people affected by cancer in Ireland have access to the best and have access to world-class cancer research, that it's not just something that happens in different countries that patients have to travel for, or, might happen in these foreign other countries.
And America.
Happens right here in Ireland, and happen to such a good quality in Ireland. We're very lucky about the quality of cancer experts that we have in the country.
Yeah, we are. You're absolutely right. And for people who want to know how to take part, Gerry, in a cancer trial, if they want to, what would you say?
Well, again, it's first just ask your
Just
doctor.
ask. That's
Just
what it's
ask them.
called.
Sorry if you're going to do the hashtag just ask, but just ask your doctor or your clinical team. They'll say to you, look, there is a trial, or there is a trial, or look at. And
Yeah, they always know, or do they have to go and look?
sometimes they go look, and sometimes, the good news is though that if you take cancer, 90% of our cancer doctors across Ireland are a member of Cancer Trials Ireland. And for instance, we will email out all those doctors for, say, lung cancer every month. What are the trials that are currently open, and what are the trials that are about to open or coming down the track?
That's
So a lot of
reassuring.
communication.
But 90% of people who work in oncology as medics are involved in this anyway.
And maybe it's slightly over 90%, but it's at least 90%. So they'll be aware of the clinical trials that are out there. They'll receive all the mail shots. They're very often, we do very regular meetings, say, for instance, our breast cancer or colorectal cancer groups, to say what trials are we going to bring in, what's currently opening, what has opened and how is it running, and we'll have updates very regularly about all those issues. So that keeps us informed as doctors, but we will sometimes forget stuff too. And again, that's where, we have the website too, to say, look at the portal, search down. The trial hopefully will be there if it's relevant to you. If it's not, just the search terms a little bit, and keep checking back as we update the website. It gets updated every couple of weeks and so on. So hopefully that should make you aware of the trial that's available to you.
I think we would like to get to some more questions, but before we do, we just want to ask Claire about the Irish Cancer Society. You obviously fund Cancer Trials Ireland to the tune of €1 million per year, which is a lot of money. Why do you do it?
Because, as you say, we're the largest voluntary, so non-government funder of cancer trials in Ireland, and actually the largest non-government funder of research in cancer research in general in Ireland, to the tune of 1 million. And ultimately, the reason we do that, as I've said, really, trials are essential for making sure patients are getting first access to a drug they otherwise wouldn't get access to. And with 44,000 people diagnosed with cancer every year in Ireland, that's really important, that we want the majority of them to get access to a clinical trial. So it's about working with Cancer Trials Ireland to really get more patients on trials and to bring more trials to Ireland. And I suppose another aspect Gerry touched on earlier is around bringing different trials to Ireland. So we have these great drug trials that are cancer medicines that, are really help treat a person affected by cancer, like what Jed was on. But there's also all these other types of cancer trials that maybe don't have the funding that these drug trials have, that we need to bring to Ireland, because they offer really important options for.
And your funding involves extending to them as
Oh
well.
yeah, exactly. So, some of the things that we're very, involved in is driving forward more trials in surgery, more trials in radiotherapy, more trials that look to improve the quality of life of patients. So one of these examples.
Which is key, because sometimes people, it isn't about extending life, it's about improving quality of life.
And I suppose, let me tell you about Sharzy. So Sharzy was on this trial. It was the positive trial. It was a trial that we helped bring to Ireland. And really what that trial involved was, these women, they were affected by breast cancer. They are on a specific type of breast cancer drug, which mean that they couldn't try to get pregnant on that drug. It induced menopause. And for this study, what they looked at was whether a woman could temporarily come off their medication, their cancer medicine, for 1 or 2 years, try to have a baby safely, and it not affect whether their cancer returns or not. And, that's a really important question. These people did not get any new drug. They did not get any intervention. They got more monitoring. And
This is the de-escalation that we're talking about.
exactly. And I'm delighted that Sharzy was one of the many women, but one of women in Ireland, and she had a little baby girl a year later. So, it's not just about drug trials that are really important. It's about the quality of that life as well. And really, we need to have these trials to test for those type of quality of life issues too.
And maybe lastly, because I know we're time-wise, but just to be sure, because we're trying to address people's fears, etc. So Gerry, just touch on, there is other funding that goes into Cancer Trials Ireland, some of which is from the pharma industry, etc. Will you just touch on that so people know that we're very, very clear
Sure.
what I suppose there's government funding, there's Irish Cancer Society funding, but there's other funding too. Will you just touch on that so people know that they are getting all the information
That's out there.
that is out there?
So we're so grateful for the Irish Cancer Society. First of all, I want to say that they are our biggest supporter, and that's really important to us. So we're really grateful that people support Irish Cancer Society too. But yes, we do often have other funding sources.
Sure.
So the Health Research Board fund us too as well. And then sometimes when I say a pharma company wants to test out a new cancer medicine, what really happens is they will pay for the extra additional costs for the running of the trial, because running the trial is not just about providing the medicine, it's about the assessments, making sure those assessments are done in a very standardized and very robust and scientific manner. And that takes a lot of work. There's a lot of work of even setting up a trial. So setting up a trial takes thousands and thousands of euros. So because of all the approvals, we've talked
Sure.
about the ethics committees, the governance, the hospitals that have to take part.
And so it should.
That's what it should.
Needs to
And
happen.
and sometimes a trial where there's extra scans, obviously we don't expect the health service to pay for it. Therefore, we would expect the funder or the sponsor of the study. The sponsor very often may be a pharmaceutical company, and therefore they will pay us to run a clinical trial, and that'll be costed out, and those costs will go in running those scans and to pay for the medicines, to pay for the additional bits around it.
Okay.
So we do receive funding in that element too as well.
And you're very open about that. Before we go, I think we might try and get to a few more of the questions that have come in from those of you who are out there watching. And as I say, we're delighted to have you. Why are we in Ireland, I'm just reading these questions now directly, only trialing drugs that are already approved in other countries? Why are we so far behind? Is that true?
I don't think that's true. So we sometimes will, as you just given about the pregnancy study, whereby that is a trial that already was approved, but we're looking about de-escalating that particular drug. That might be an example of where a medicine is approved, but it's in a clinical trial. But very often what we tend to do is we tend to, trial medicines that are not approved, certainly in the European medicines area. But usually the way that, pharmaceutical companies, if it's a drug, they will very often, it'll not be available in America first, and it'll be at the same time. So it'll not
Yeah,
happen beyond that.
I wonder if somebody been given a little bit of misinformation about that. Another person has asked, can patients be referred to go on trials in other EU countries? So members of people who live in Ireland, can they go elsewhere?
Yeah. So technically they can be referred. The challenge very often is covering the non-trial part of their care, or if something goes wrong on that trial, and also the ability to attend for monitoring and support and safety. As Jed mentioned, sometimes we need a lot of support through a trial. For instance, say you take acutely unwell or you're sick at home and you need emergency care, and if that trial is only available, say, in Belgium, you can't easily get to Belgium for that care. And it's those bits around the trial make it very difficult
So
to take part of
practical barrier.
the reasons around that. And also sometimes the health service in another area, say for instance, say you take the example of say France or Belgium, they won't accept you because they won't pay for routine care costs outside of that trial. So it technically is possible, but it is practically very challenging.
Excuse me, another question here. Do we have enough staff to facilitate these trials? The oncology departments are swamped and trials take place in busy oncology departments. I'm on a trial myself, so this person.
So I have to say, being honest, we don't. And it's one thing we really want is we want clinical trials to be very much the routine clinical care we deliver in our cancer centers or cancer units, whereby we have a whole cadre of research staff to support cancer trials. It's one of the things that holds us back in terms of delivering more clinical trials, is not having the staff or those systems to support clinical trials in a bigger way. So a plea to anybody listening is, please do consider funding these research books. They're not just essential for trials, they're essential for routine clinical care.
This is actually a really good question, and thank you to whoever sent this one in. What happens if the cancer trial isn't working? Who decides the next steps?
That's a really good question. So
Yeah, it is.
again, one of the checks we have in every trial is what's called usually a steering committee or the data management group. And what they do is they're not connected with the trialists, and they routinely, and usually it's every 2 or 3 months, check the results of the study. The trialists themselves may not be available or not be allowed to access results, but the data monitoring group will be able to monitor, and they very carefully check the study. So if they're concerned that there's, for instance, too much toxicity of the new drug, or the new drug is not, our new treatment is not faring just as well, they might say, actually, let's stop the study now. And in fact, they're overcautious. Very often we've seen a number of trials where the drug probably was slightly better than the standard of care, but it's been stopped too early because we want to be cautious and safe. And sometimes we have to go back and answer that question again. But there's a lot of checkpoints in that to make sure that we don't disadvantage patients in clinical trial.
We might leave it with this one because it's kind of a reiteration of something we touched on earlier. But Are there any cancer trials for triple negative breast cancer with gene mutations? Are there any trials for stage 4 colon cancer? So these are very specific questions. And there's lots of them like that, but they're about ovarian cancer and they're about all different cancers. Please, because that is probably the main reason people are looking in at this webinar today, remind people if they have a specific question about their cancer, what they should do.
So the hashtag is just ask. So just ask your doctor, your clinical team. Go to cancertrials.ie, go to the webpage, check out, see what's available there. And you should hopefully find the information you need either there or with your clinical team.
And you might have to do a little bit of routing.
You might have to search around a little bit, and that's perfectly okay. If you find something that you think might be useful or relevant to you, take it to your doctor and say, is this suitable for me? And they'll be more than happy to deal with that.
Look, I really do hope this has been very helpful for everyone who is out there watching this afternoon. I certainly feel more informed. My thanks to our esteemed panel, to Professor Gerry Hanna, to Dr. Ciara Kilty, and perhaps most importantly to Jed Vanderpoel for taking part this afternoon. I'm Dr. Ciara Kelly. I genuinely hope that has been helpful, and we are delighted that you joined us this afternoon, and thank you very much indeed.